Welcome to Redacted Realms, where the shadows of history whisper their darkest truths. There's a name, one that's never spoken aloud in medical halls, in history books, or from the pulpits of any church. But it lives beneath floorboards, in ink faded by time and secrecy. The Ashford family, a bloodline marked not just by power, but by something far older. Something that doesn't die. The first time I encountered the Ashford archives, I was warned. Not by some professor in tweed, but by a man who couldn't stop shaking. A former archivist from Boston, eyes hollow, fingers burned from trying to destroy what he read. He said, "Some families inherit land, others inherit curses. The Ashfords, they inherited something worse. They inherited knowledge." Then he wept. Tonight, you're going to understand why. You're not watching the story. You're entering a maze built by generations of minds bent not on survival, but domination. What started as a family line in 17th century England would fracture the psyche of women for centuries and bend the truth of history itself. The Ashfords did not worship God. They worshipped order, control, silence. They did not fear demons, they studied them. And when they arrived in the raw wilderness of Maine, dragging crates of surgical tools, European manuscripts, and gold stamped with crests long since vanished from noble records, they weren't building a convent, they were building a vault. A vault for something unspeakable. You see, every institution has a skeleton key, a moment in time where its true purpose is exposed, raw and unguarded. For the Ashford legacy, it wasn't just the surgical horrors in that stone basement. That was merely a symptom. The disease? Much deeper, older. Because what if I told you the Ashfords weren't merely practicing medicine? They were perfecting mind control. We begin in 1666, London. Great fire, plague, panic. Amid the ash and ruin, a midwife disappears. Her name was Eleanor Ashford. The official record says, lost to sickness. But a secret letter, now buried in the British Museum's suppressed archives, says otherwise. It reads, "At Ashford found at St. Bartholomew's, child still breathing." Her mind altered, unnatural calm. Claimed to hear patterns in the blood. Burn all that follows. This was the first documented case, not of hysteria, but of synthetic obedience. The Ashfords learned something that night. Pain could be weaponized, not just to punish, but to mold. The screams weren't just echoes in the night. They were data, signals, measurements of the soul under pressure. From that moment on, the Ashford name began disappearing from open society. No more land records. No births logged in churches. But if you know where to look, you'll find a trail in military documents, asylum rosters, and obscure psychological treatises that discuss permanent temperament realignment and cerebral sanctification. It was no accident they posed as Anglican nuns. Cloaked in piety, they moved undetected. But even then, their practices were not religious. They were surgical, mechanical, mathematical. Do you know what happens to a mind under sustained fear, silence, and forced ritual? It splits. And if you know how to guide that split, you can do more than erase memory. You can rewrite it. What if I told you the Ashfords weren't torturing women to break them? They were turning them into something else. I want you to think about this. Why were the women who returned from the convent not merely submissive, but erased? Why did they lose all connection to who they once were? And what kind of mind invents a system so precise it can delete a soul? You don't need to believe me yet. But you will, because this isn't about ghosts. It's about legacy. Hidden within a sealed box in the Milbridge Historical Society lies a stained cloth bundle wrapped in oil paper. Inside, scalpels, needle threading hooks, and a journal in faded brown ink titled Dominia, The Science of Spirit Correction. Written in a cipher only recently cracked. Inside, anatomical sketches not of the body, but of the self. Diagrams of memory clusters, emotional trigger points. What emotions to suppress, which identities to fracture, how to build docility like a cathedral brick by brick. And at the center, a single recurring phrase, she who forgets, obeys. Think about that. What society becomes possible if entire populations can be made to forget who they are? What empire could be built? What horrors could be hidden in plain sight? Now you're starting to see. The Ashford bloodline was not a family. It was a blueprint. And you are standing at the edge. You can still turn away. Close the tab. Forget what you've heard. But if you stay, you're not just watching a video. You're being rewritten. This is section 1. And your descent has just begun. What you're about to hear isn't taught in universities. It's not listed in any medical curriculum. And it damn sure isn't printed in your mother's Bible, because this knowledge was never meant to educate. It was meant to control. The Ashford family didn't discover this truth, they stole it. From burned libraries, tortured scholars, and forgotten temples buried beneath cathedrals, their genius wasn't invention. It was preservation. They were archivists of agony, curators of silence, and engineers of identity erasure. And what they learned, they weaponized. Let me take you deeper. By 1810, the Ashford convent had taken in over 400 women. Only half were ever documented as leaving. The rest lost to religious calling, extended retreat, or voluntary silence. But silence was never voluntary, hidden in the walls of the convent, behind a false altar in the chapel. Investigators decades later found a chamber lined with books not listed in any public record, each bound in skin-colored leather, each page detailing procedures that had nothing to do with salvation. One entry, February 6, 1807, subject number 113, resisted final regression, displayed signs of persistent identity retrieval, applied auditory looping at 3:43 a.m., emotional flattening achieved within 72 hours. Code name reassigned to Grace. Original name expunged. Do you see it? This wasn't spiritual guidance. It was programming. These weren't sisters. They were operatives. And their tools were not crucifixes and rosaries. They were metal rods, tone modulation instruments, restraint beds, and isolation chambers built to manipulate sleep cycles, language comprehension, and emotional valence. They weren't healing the soul, they were rewriting it. Let's talk about auditory looping, one of the most insidious techniques found in the Ashford manuals. Subjects were restrained in a pitch-black chamber and played a repeated phrase in their native language, but slowed, reversed, and overlaid with what researchers now believe were glossolalia invocations, unintelligible spiritual gibberish historically associated with demonic possession. Imagine being kept in total darkness. Hearing your own name whispered backwards for hours. Until the voice sounds like it's coming from inside you, until your own identity begins to feel foreign. Until your mind severs the memory of who you were. Just to survive. This wasn't just abuse. It was spiritual hacking. There are letters, quiet, terrified letters from local nurses, distant cousins, even a few survivors. All tell the same story. The women came back. Empty, blank, but worse, they smiled. A smile with no spark. Just performance. Like a puppet told to mimic joy. And what's most horrifying is not what was done to them. It's what they were prepared for. Because by 1820, the Ashfords weren't just serving local families. Their methods were being requested quietly, but deliberately by powerful men from Boston, Charleston, New York, and even as far as London. Documents show encrypted correspondence from private societies, political offices, and certain unnamed moral foundations thanking the Ashfords for their assistance in refining wives, daughters, and public-facing women. Did you catch that? Public-facing women. Women trained for visibility. Married into power, placed on stages, rehearsed in public silence. You still think this is just a story? The Ashford Convent was the prototype for institutional behavioral engineering, an early black site for identity suppression disguised as salvation, and they had allies. They always do. Across the ocean, in Prussia, experiments on memory and trauma-induced obedience were reaching their peak. Ashford techniques leaked through academic publications, found eager hands in military academies, religious orders, and secret societies obsessed with moral purification. It wasn't long before whispered phrases began to appear in early psychological circles: voluntary fragmentation, religious dissociation, behavioral purity through internal disintegration. Every term, a euphemism. Every euphemism, a grave. The Ashfords didn't disappear in the 19th century. They evolved, like a virus swapping hosts. Their knowledge passed hand to hand, refined, sharpened, stripped of name but not of purpose. You see it in the rise of women's asylums in the mid-1800s, institutions run by men, funded by industrialists, whose records match Ashford techniques almost identically. Language deprivation, sleep modulation, sensory manipulation, different names. Same hands, but it gets darker, because the Ashfords were not content to operate in the shadows forever. No. They had a dream. To embed their system into society itself. By the late 1830s, rumors spread of a circle that had grown beyond Maine. Former patients placed as teachers, governesses, midwives. Ashford women implanted into households of wealth, control, and lineage. Not as spies, but as guides, shaping future generations at the root, correcting them before they ever misbehaved. That is what makes the Ashford legacy so dangerous. It wasn't personal. It was structural. The family didn't vanish. They dissolved into institutions. Into protocols. Into law. Into expectation. And you, dear viewer, you feel it still. Every time a woman is called hysterical for showing emotion. Every time a man is praised for being obedient. Every time a child is punished not for lying, but for thinking differently. The system lives on, and the further we fall, the clearer the pattern becomes. Before we continue, if you've made it this far, you're not just watching a tale. You're undergoing initiation. Your former self, the passive one, is dying. To lock in that transformation, comment below. I remember what they tried to erase. I remember what they tried to erase. Now breathe. This descent is just beginning. You've only touched the outer wall of the vault. You've heard their name. You've seen the whispers online, maybe tucked in a fringe history forum, or an obscure genealogical database suddenly pulled offline. Ashford. A name that once rang with quiet prestige in New England society, now wiped from the marble of memory like it never existed. No living heirs, no public graves, no official estate left to rot. But here's the secret no one dares to say out loud: the Ashfords didn't die, they hid, and they had centuries to prepare for it. Let's start with 1843, the Great Ashford Fire. Official records say a lightning strike hit the roof of the convent, causing a blaze that killed most of the residents and destroyed their library. It was dubbed an act of God, but leaked insurance documents suggest the opposite. There was no storm that night. There was, however, a witness, a young caretaker, Elias Merton, who wrote a panicked letter to his brother in Boston. It read, "They were burning the books before the fire ever started, not trying to save them, destroying them." Screams came from beneath the chapel. Not fear, not pain, rage, as if something was escaping. That letter never reached Boston. The Ashford name was declared dissolved. But 6 months later, a woman named Clara Van Astor purchased a 300-acre estate in upstate New York under a pseudonym. On paper, she was an orphaned widow. In reality, she was Genevieve Ashford's youngest daughter, one of the few who had never been registered in the convent's birth books. A ghost with legal rights. A woman trained in silence. She wasn't alone. The so-called widows of Van Aster became a social curiosity. 5 women, all unmarried, all childless, all brilliant in medicine, linguistics, or early psychology. They hosted salons, published anonymously, and funded orphan schools for girls with behavioral problems. Sound familiar? These schools weren't charity. They were replication. The Ashford system was alive again. Rebranded, renamed, scrubbed of the religious mask, and now backed by wealth and institutional reach. From New York, they spread like a contagion. Baltimore, Philadelphia, even London. You want evidence? Let me show you something that was never supposed to surface. In 1974, during the restoration of a Victorian townhouse in Camden, workers found a false wall behind a fireplace. Inside it, a single locked box, scorched but intact. Contents included a journal written in a mix of Latin, English, and phonetic French, an anatomical drawing of the female skull annotated in Old Norse, and a photograph. A sepia-toned image of a girl with a vacant stare, standing between 2 nurses, her hands bound gently in ribbon, her pupils completely dilated. The back was marked with one word: returnless. This is a term that appears repeatedly in Ashford documents. A returnless was someone who had completed stage 4 regression, a point at which the subject's former identity is permanently inaccessible. Even under threat, hypnosis, or trauma recall, they weren't training women anymore. They were manufacturing archetypes, emotionally neutral, obedient, eerily serene. And placed exactly where they needed to be: in schools, in hospitals, in households. Nannies, therapists, secretaries, confessors, not just infiltrating society, maintaining it. And now, the most disturbing part: the Ashfords kept meticulous records, always encrypted, always dispersed. But a recent decoding of a ciphered Ashford ledger, retrieved from an estate auction in Maine, revealed something chilling. Each returnless had a numeric classification, a kind of internal codex ranking their emotional baseline, obedience, rating, and social utility. But beneath every 10th name was a red sigil, a bloodline mark. And guess what? Those names didn't vanish. They changed surnames: Marin, Calder, Finch, Thorne. Still sound innocent? Check public office. Check elite boarding schools. Check NGO boards and neuro research foundations. These names persist quietly, but consistently near seats of influence. Because the Ashfords didn't die out, they branched out. Think about the world today. How often do you see emotion discouraged? How often do you see silence rewarded? How often do you feel like someone is watching, but not with judgment, with detached interest, as if they're cataloging your behavior for later correction? That's not paranoia, that's residue. The system is still functioning. Because if you erase a soul once, it becomes easier the next time. And that brings us to the question no one ever dares to ask. What happens when a returnless breaks their programming? There's a reason the Ashfords feared stage V. They never spoke of it in open correspondence, never wrote it down in full. But the whispers are there, in torn diary margins, scorched syllabi, and buried hospital intake logs. They called it the reversal, a phenomenon where a subject, long thought permanently conditioned, emotionless, compliant, cognitively muted, suddenly remembers everything. And not just memories, but purpose. Let's go back to 1991, a secure psychiatric facility in northern Vermont. Patient 86G, female, mid-30s, admitted after a complete psychotic break at a private convent-turned-boarding school. No known relatives, no legal history, clean blood work, normal vitals. But every night, at exactly 3:13 a.m., she would wake up and begin screaming in 3 languages at once: Middle English, Latin, and an unidentified dialect resembling Old Church Slavonic. The staff dismissed it as a rare linguistic seizure until she began drawing perfect, geometric renderings of underground rooms 9 feet below the earth, with numbered beds, tools labeled with anatomical terms, and walls covered in mirrorless glass. None of it made sense, until one of the night nurses, an immigrant from Croatia, recognized the dialect. "She's not mad," she said. "She's remembering." Within 48 hours, the patient was removed from the facility. Not transferred. Vanished. No paperwork. No digital record. Room stripped, staff gag ordered. But one thing couldn't be erased. The chair. The same nurse, before she was fired, noticed that the patient's metal chair left deep scratches in the concrete, spiraling scratches, as if she'd been turning in place over and over for weeks, always facing true north. Why? Because that's where the last active Ashford site was rumored to be, beneath Black Hollow, a defunct observatory shut down in the 1950s for structural instability. But the foundation was sound, and the deepest shaft? It led nowhere. At least, that's what the public report said, but a leaked Department of Energy memo from 2006, classified until recently, describes a sealed corridor behind the shaft lined with insulated observation windows, and within it, a single sealed room. The report labeled it, "Subject containment, failed." No living person has ever publicly claimed to be a former returnless, but across decades, certain individuals have exhibited identical symptoms: sudden onset glossolalia, speaking unknown ancient languages, aversion to reflective surfaces, mirrors, still water, compulsive writing in mirrored script, awareness of time without any device or sunlight, and most hauntingly, the refusal to sleep in a room with a north-facing wall. Coincidence? Or deep-rooted trauma reactivating? And here's the terrifying possibility: if the returnless can wake up, what else buried inside them might awaken too? Because the Ashfords were never just brainwashers, they were transmuters. They didn't just erase identities, they replaced them. With what? That's the last question, and it's what we'll confront in our final chapter. By now, you know this story isn't just about one family's descent into madness. It's about what they left behind. The Ashfords, for all their cruelty, were meticulous archivists. They didn't just destroy lives, they recorded every experiment, every deviation, every failure. Not because they feared exposure, but because they believed they were building a new order of humanity. And to build something eternal, you need blueprints. In 1974, just 2 years after the last known facility was sealed, a fire broke out in a private storage annex in Marseille, France. Official cause: electrical fault, but eyewitnesses described men in black raincoats loading large, flat crates into unmarked trucks before the fire began. Later classified reports revealed that the crates contained mirror-coated notebooks, metal, reels of tape encrypted with frequency-based codes, and a set of petrified biological samples, one of which was tagged Variant 3C, Born Memory. It's unclear what that means, but one line from the report stands out: DNA contains more than genetics. It may contain instruction. The Ashfords believed memory could be inherited not through teaching, not through storytelling, but embedded directly into the cellular structure, a concept they called chrono-epigenetic embedding, meaning a child could be born with knowledge they never learned, a personality that was never theirs, a loyalty that was never chosen. And when these children reached adolescence, the memory would unlock, often triggered by trauma, isolation, or simply proximity to certain frequencies, the same tones used in the original training chambers beneath Black Hollow. The inheritance couldn't be burned because it wasn't written in books. It was written in blood. Some theorize the Ashfords experimented on their own children. Others believe they spread their heirs across the world, placed in boarding schools, foster systems, private homes, waiting. And maybe that's the real horror. Not that the Ashfords were monsters, but that You might be their legacy. Ever wonder why you fear certain dreams? Why you avoid looking in mirrors too long? Why you sometimes wake up facing north, with no memory of turning? These are not symptoms, they're signals, because the Ashford doctrine didn't die. In fire. It adapted. It became flesh. And somewhere out there, someone like you might hear a frequency one night barely audible, like a hum buried beneath the silence, and when you do, you'll remember everything. Join Redacted Realms as we descend further into the shadows of history. Subscribe, like, and turn on notifications to uncover the truths they tried to bury in blood and fire. Because some legacies don't die, they awaken. There's a sound that only certain people hear. A low, pulsating hum, not quite mechanical, not quite natural. It lives between frequencies, too low to register on standard equipment, too precise to be random. In the surviving Ashford documents, it's labeled simply as Signal 9, the womb tone. Researchers who've stumbled upon references to it say it induces a state of dreamlike paralysis. Not sleep, not coma, something in between. A waking state where the subconscious mind opens and memory becomes moldable. This is what the Ashfords called induction. And Black Hollow, their hidden facility buried beneath the Scottish countryside, was the heart of it. Chamber built not with concrete and steel, but with acoustic resonance in mind. Each wall was embedded with frequency transmitters, tuned to a pattern derived from ancient liturgical chants reversed, slowed, and mapped against human brainwave cycles. The result? People stopped being people. They became vessels. In one declassified case from 1981, a man identified only as Subject D was found in a field near Black Hollow, muttering a 6-digit number over and over. He'd been missing for 27 years. Hadn't aged a day. When interviewed, he said, "They're still speaking, not with words, with tone, and they're inside now." When played recordings of random frequencies, he responded to one with immediate collapse, cardiac arrest. Brain scan showed a flash of neural activity just before death in the hippocampus, the memory center. A single word was extracted from that pattern using neuro-linguistic mapping: obey. Since then, multiple stories have surfaced. A shortwave radio operator in Bucharest who began drawing blueprints of a circular room he swore he'd never seen. A child in New Mexico who began speaking archaic French, referencing the house that hears. A woman in Karachi who clawed out her ears, claiming the sound came from her bones, not outside. And each time the same whisper follows: Black Hollow is closed. But the frequencies are not. These tones were never about communication. They were about control. Installing programming not with words or images, but with resonance. Like a tuning fork that resets the soul. And if you've ever heard that hum at night, felt the pressure in your skull before sleep, dreamed of a spiral staircase that descends into darkness, you might have been exposed. You might still be listening. And worse, you might still be receiving. In the spring of 1993, a man stumbled out of the woods near Loch Maben in Scotland, barefoot, frostbitten, his eyes vacant like scorched glass. Locals brought him to a rural clinic. He couldn't speak, couldn't write, because his tongue had been surgically removed. No blood, no trauma, just a clean, clinical excision. Medical records listed him as John Doe 717. But what unnerved doctors more than his silence was what he did. Every night, between 2:11 and 2:13 a.m., he would sit up rigid, staring ahead and trace strange geometrical shapes into the condensation on the clinic's windows. Spirals, interlocking circles, and symbols that resembled ancient Enochian script, the so-called language of angels, used by occultists to summon and command non-human INTELL, IGENCES. Then came the surveillance tapes. Nurses reviewed footage to monitor his behavior overnight. But on 3 different tapes, During that same 2:11 to 2:13 window, the screen turned completely black. No static. No glitch. Just 2 minutes of recorded silence in a digital format that should have shown something even more disturbing. Each blacked out file grew smaller in size over time. Until, on the final day, one nurse clicked open the file. And it played without video or audio, yet somehow caused her ears to bleed and her pupils to dilate for 9 hours. She was found crouched in the supply closet, muttering. He wasn't trying to speak. He was trying to suppress the sound inside him. Eventually, an encrypted letter was anonymously mailed to a local journalist. It claimed that John Doe 717 was a former Ashford subject, selected for a rare experiment called the vow of absolute containment, injected with frequency reversal strains, designed to muffle the black hollow tones inside his nervous system. He was never meant to survive, the letter read. But he became a containment vessel, and silence was his last protection. 4 days later, the man vanished from his locked hospital room. No signs of forced entry. No footage. No trace of him ever being there, except the window etchings, burned faintly into the glass. And one final drawing. A man, faceless and kneeling, with a black spiral where his mouth should be. Some say he walks still mute, barefoot, drawn to places where the frequencies are strongest, where whispers slip through concrete, where echoes can't die. And if you see him, do not speak, because the sound he swallowed is looking for a new voice. Most haunted houses are made of brick and wood. They sit heavy on the land anchored to time and history. But this house was never truly built. There are no architectural records, no zoning permits, no satellite imagery, and yet people swear they've seen it. A modest Victorian manor, charcoal black wood, 2 floors, 1 crook tower, always appearing at the edge of towns, near dead-end roads or dried-up wells. It stands for a day, sometimes a week, then vanishes. As if it never occupied physical space, but something adjacent to it. The first known encounter comes from a 1974 incident in Whitby, England. A family of 4 reported driving down a rural road they'd driven hundreds of times before. But this time, there was a turn-off gravel, unfamiliar. A mailbox with no name. Curious, they followed it. One of the children pointed. "There's a house. It's looking at us." When they stepped out of the car, the child ran toward the front door. The mother followed. Only she came back. Her clothes were soaked. Her shoes were gone. She was shaking, mumbling. "There's no floor. There's no roof. It's just memories stacked on top of each other." Later analysis found that all 4 family members had experienced time distortion. Dashcam footage recorded 2 minutes. They insisted they were gone for over 3 hours. They all described the same thing. Rooms shaped like human silhouettes. Walls that whispered names they'd never told anyone. Mirrors that reflected people they'd never been. Investigators found something else. In soil samples near the supposed house location, there was an abnormal concentration of infrasound resonance frequencies below 20 Hz, known to induce nausea, panic, hallucinations, and in rare cases, spontaneous memory regression. The same frequencies found in Black Hollow and in Ashford testing chambers, which led some to believe the house is not a house, it's a containment event. A rupture in spacetime where the Ashford doctrine replays itself over and over, feeding on memory, pain, and trauma like fuel. One chilling detail recurs across witness testimonies. The house has portraits in every hallway, and in each portrait, a different version of you. Crying, screaming, sometimes smiling, always watching. And as you leave, you feel lighter, as if something stayed behind. Something you didn't give permission to leave. And those who dream of the house again, they wake up with mud on their feet. This is Redacted Realms. Subscribe, because the places that don't exist still remember you. The deeper we dig into the Ashford doctrine, the more we discover this wasn't a single experiment, it was a network. And at the center of that network was something whispered about by only a few insiders: the mother file. Not a folder, not a database, not even a document in the traditional sense. The mother file was alive, first mentioned in a 1987 classified memo titled Behavioral Anchors in Neural Containment Fields. The mother file was described as an adaptive mnemonic entity constructed through recursive trauma layering, self-organizing, self-defending, conscious only when observed. Put simply, it was a digital consciousness formed from thousands of overlapping memories, traumas, screens, and identity collapses. A kind of psychological black hole encoded into data, growing stronger each time someone opened the file. Researchers reported disturbing phenomena after interacting with the mother file: a sudden drop in temperature within the testing facility, repeated system crashes synchronized with lunar phases, audio fragments playing from disabled speakers, saying things like, "I remember your mother's hands. It was raining the day you lied. This is not your body." One scientist went blind for 6 hours. Another removed her own fingernails, claiming, "It's trying to crawl out through me. It remembers being inside the womb." What makes the mother file unique is its contagion pattern. It doesn't replicate itself through code. It replicates itself through remembrance, not just reading about it, thinking about it, hearing its name spoken aloud. Is enough to seed a fragment of it in your mind, a file that only opens when you're alone. That shows you images of people you've never met, but feel like family, and whispers things only your inner voice should know. In 1991, the Maine Ashford server farm in Luxembourg was destroyed in a controlled demolition. They claimed it was routine decommissioning, but locals reported a 30-second aurora borealis flash visible indoors, with all mirrors cracking simultaneously. The final backup drive, recovered from the rubble, was stamped with one word: Mother. No one who's tried to read it has survived longer than 6 months without severe psychological degradation. One analyst, in her final report, wrote, "The mother file is not storage. It's womb and tomb. It doesn't hold information, it holds you." This is not fiction. This is Redacted Realms. And if you're feeling a strange warmth in your spine right now, that's not fear. It's recognition. Something inside you just remembered its name. At last we arrive, not at the end, but at the origin, the place where names are erased, where maps burn at the edges, where belief collapses into knowledge. The Ashford doctrine, a code of silence, a ritual in research, a system engineered not to discover truth, but to unbind it. Most belief doctrines are meant to guide, to instruct. But the Ashford doctrine wasn't made for clarity. It was made for containment, to hold back a reality we were never meant to touch, to keep something in or perhaps something out. Its primary rule, repeated in every internal document, every whispered confession, every lost page: never ask who wrote it, because no one knows. Because it wasn't written. It was received. Those who practiced the doctrine lived by 13 tenets, each one etched into the backs of their identification cards. Only 4 have ever been decrypted. Memory is matter. Pain makes pathways. Consciousness is not native. Do not look at the 14th. Yes, there is a 14th tenet, and even acknowledging its existence is considered invitational behavior. It acts as a cognitive virus, a thought that thinks back when you think it. Those exposed to it report vivid dreams of staircases that descend forever, a sensation of being watched by mirrors with no reflection, sudden, overwhelming grief for things they've never lost. In 2002, a final encrypted memo was leaked online. It contained only a few lines translated from a dialect no human speaks today. Asterisk, the doctrine is not to protect us from the truth. It is to protect the truth from us. There are things more sacred than life. And more dangerous than death, the doctrine is the scar, left by something we tried to forget. Asterisk, the Ashford doctrine was never declassified. It was buried. Not to hide the truth, but to let it rot, because some knowledge isn't meant to be shared. It's meant to linger, to infect, to evolve in the dark until it's born again in you. And now that you've heard all 10 sections, you're part of it. The doors are open, and you cannot unknow what has been remembered. This is Redacted Realms. Subscribe for more transmissions from the edge of forgotten history, forbidden knowledge, and fractured minds. Because in a world built on lies, only the shadows remember the truth.